In 1995, the following radio transmissions between Americans and Canadians made the news. After detecting an impending collision, a U.S. warship radioed, "Please divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision." The Canadian response, "Recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision." The Americans, "This is the captain of a U.S. Navy ship. I say again, divert your course." The Canadians, "Negative. I say again, you divert your course." The Americans, and this next transmission is in all caps. "This is the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, the second largest ship in the United States Atlantic Fleet. I demand that you change your course 15 degrees north, that's 5 degrees north, or countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of this ship." The Canadian response, "This is a lighthouse. Your call." I'll get back to that story in a moment. Last spring, I discovered a Buddhist teaching that I'd not previously encountered, at least not in this form. It's titled The Three Poisons, and it speaks quite poignantly to three characteristics of human behavior. According to Buddhist teachings, the three poisons are ignorance, greed, and anger. The three poisons also go by other names in the literature, but I'll rely on these names for today. My topic, though, may seem somewhat negative to you, the three poisons, but it is essential to understand these traps of the human personality if we are to wisely cultivate their opposites: awareness, generosity, and compassion. Of the three poisons, ignorance clearly stands out as primary because greed and anger flow out of our ignorance. So what is meant by ignorance? In Buddhist teachings, ignorance is associated with a misguided understanding of ourselves. That is, an elevated sense of our separate beings. We have no sense, or a diminished sense, that we and other beings come from the same source. We have lost, if indeed we ever had, an understanding that all beings are related, that everything that exists is interrelated. I love this teaching because it resonates well with Unitarian Universalism's seventh principle, in which we affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. That's our seventh principle. And if you're not familiar with the 7 Unitarian Universalist principles and our 6 sources from which we draw inspiration, they can be found on the page preceding hymn number 1 in the gray hymnal. What I've come to believe about interdependence is that even if we understand our interrelatedness with our intellects, it is much more difficult to understand it with our hearts, and it is seldom demonstrated in our actions. We live most of our lives, Buddhism would say, quite independently, as if we have no impact, no care, and no concern for the rest of the web of life. In the story with which I started, the U.S. Navy captain was certainly not ignorant of lighthouses, and I'm sure he understood the relationship between ships and lighthouses and how they impact one another. But in his day-to-day duties, he likely gives little thought beyond the immediate needs of his ship unless forced to do so. Perhaps rightly so, he was not concerned with the big picture. In his actions as the captain of a ship, he operated as if the world revolved around his ship, its needs, and perhaps even the captain's own whims. The Buddhists might say that he had an elevated sense of self. So how does any of this relate to the rest of us? Just like the ship captain, I think we have an intellectual understanding of our interrelatedness with the web of life. But Buddhism asks us whether this understanding of interrelatedness is alive in our hearts. and in our day-to-day decisions. Like the ship captain, are we more focused on our immediate needs and perhaps our immediate whims? If ignorance is the poison, then awareness is the remedy or antidote. I see this awareness of deeply lived interrelatedness as a spiritual opportunity. And by that I mean the opportunity to live our lives fully aware, day by day, moment by moment, aware of our interdependence, fully aware of how our decisions and our actions affect the web of life, keenly in tune with how our actions impact all that exists, an opportunity to be deeply appreciative of how our lives are enriched by so much beyond ourselves. Now, if this seems overwhelming, let me suggest a starting place. We are the inheritors of a wonderful tradition of pausing before every meal and bringing into our awareness all that has made that meal possible. It can be a prayer, or it can be a time to simply take note and be thankful. And if you want to take a page from a different playbook, I have a colleague who, whenever he encounters a dead animal on the road, silently gives thanks for the animal's life while acknowledging the role that society played leading to the animal's death. Whatever the activity, it's about increasing our awareness day by day, moment by moment, of our interdependence with the web of all existence of which we are a part, to quote our seventh principle. Perhaps another way to deepen our awareness is by looking at Buddhism's second poison, greed. Again, Buddhism's teaching is clear that greed is largely based on ignorance. It's of an elevated sense of self and ignorance of our interdependence. Do we understand that everything that we are attached to, that we think will make us happy, has implications for others, for other beings, and for the web of existence? With the verbal sparring in Washington this past week, I felt a grossly misplaced attachment to me and mine as I listened to the bickering and the finger-pointing going on in Washington. The remedy or the antidote to this greed and attachment is generosity. Generosity of spirit and generosity in meeting my needs and your needs. After the leaders met to resolve their differences, or at least that's the way it was described, the blame game took center stage. Each side greedily attempted to grab the moral high ground. I believe a more generous report by either or both of the sides in this conflict would have been something like the following. I want you to imagine with me that they emerged from that meeting, and when they went to the microphone, one or both of them gave the following report. We both feel very strongly about our positions, and we did not make much progress. No, let me correct that. We did not make any progress. And yet we have both committed to come together again in 2 days with new proposals that move in the direction of meeting both our needs. I would like to have heard that. Generosity, though, cannot stop at mere words. It must be followed by a true understanding of the values of the other political party and a willingness to provide for both in any solution. But bickering and posturing is not unique to Washington. When two individuals are in serious conflict, a generous response would be to try to understand and affirm the needs of the other without having to first make your own case. Me first is the greedy response. Again, the poison is the greed that claims that my happiness, my rightness, my sense of self is more important, is most important. And sadly, it is attached to the other person being wrong, or the other person losing, or the other person being diminished in some way. Greed, though, most often, when we think about how it's used in language today, most often speaks to material accumulation. In Buddhist teaching, greed most often speaks to the misguided belief that our happiness is found in external things. And in our culture, our purchases consistently demonstrate that we place the self first to the detriment of others. Again, greed reflects a failure to understand our interrelatedness. What I'm about to say will not be a particularly popular position, but I want to suggest that the things that we buy, and I don't mean some of the things, everything, the things that we buy, the things that we eat, the things that we do, not all of the time, but most of the time, have an impact on others, on other beings, and on the web of existence, and that we don't fully grasp this in our hearts. Let me offer an idea that is shaping the way that I think about generosity. There's ample evidence that we are generous people in this nation. And yet, I've wondered if we compartmentalize our lives. We think maybe there's a time to be generous, and then there is the rest of my life where I just think about me. I want to suggest that interdependence knows no such compartmentalization. To live a fully interdependent life, every word and every action is done generously. In other words, speaking and acting is done with others in mind. And it influences what we buy, it influences what we eat, it even affects when we drive our car and how much we drive our car. Like awareness, living generously happens moment by moment. Let me turn my attention to the third poison, anger. But I'm going to do this one a little differently. I invite you to spend a moment with the question I am about to ask. In what ways is anger a poison? I have my text here, but I'm not going to read it. Instead of answering that question for you, I'd like to pause for 1 moment, 1 minute, and ask you to think for yourself, in what ways is anger a poison? I will ring this chime in 1 minute after each of us reflects on the question, in what ways is anger a poison? I think we have time this morning, so I will go ahead and read what is in my notes. Let it complement your own thoughts. As a starting place, I believe that anger poisons our own minds. When I listen to the news and become angry, my mind is taken over by my anger. I no longer think or listen clearly or objectively because my thoughts have been displaced, hijacked, if you will, by an intensely and unyielding negativity. In an interpersonal relationship, anger poisons the relationship. I find that anger is a barrier to much needed communication. When I get angry, I find that I am no longer able to listen. I become defensive, even irrational. And this will sound like strong language. Perhaps it is. But I also think anger is a poison because my anger transfers my venom to you. It may not be intentional, but anger often wants our opponent to suffer. Like the other poisons, anger is fueled by our perceived separateness. This could not be more true than with the ones we loved. Anger is the intense feeling that I am right and you are wrong, and anger is the chasm between us, the chasm that must be bridged. If anger is the poison, what then is the antidote? In Buddhist teaching, the remedy to anger is to cultivate compassion, patience, and forgiveness. A website I found says it this way: here we learn to openly embrace the entire spectrum of experiences without anger. And just as we practice meeting unpleasant experiences in the outer world with patience, kindness, forgiveness, and compassion, we must also practice meeting our own unpleasant feelings in the same way. Our feelings of loneliness, hurt, doubt, fear, insecurity, inadequacy, depression, and so forth, all require our openness and loving kindness. Our challenge in spiritual practice is to soften our habitual defenses, open our heart, and let go of hatred, aversion, and denial. Again, these are other words the literature uses for anger. In this way, we can meet and embrace ourselves, others, and all inner and outer experiences with great compassion and wisdom. I've been working at not letting the news make me angry. I don't want the news to poison my mind. This does not mean that I am any less determined to respond to the issues of the day. My goal is simply to not respond from a place of anger. Compassion helps me see that others, even politicians, are doing the best they can. Perhaps I should say that again. Others, especially politicians, are doing the best they can, the best they know how. And compassion helps me see that we are all imperfect individuals, especially and including myself. But here is the part I like best. Compassion helps me not be victimized by the anger of others, not be poisoned by others who are also doing the best they can. There is an issue that I have recently been thinking about, and it relates to anger. And so I'd like to put it on the table for us. I have an African-American gay colleague who tells me quite forthrightly that he has earned his right to be angry. And while he may temper his anger and use discretion in how he directs it, he will use it for the tool that it is, and he makes no apologies or excuses for it. Another way of speaking to this is to ask the question, when I, Jeff, speak of anger as a poison, am I speaking from a place of privilege? I have not been discriminated against in my lifetime. I've not been beaten up because of who I am or for any other reason in my entire life. I have never been in material want. I have never been oppressed. My colleague is not here to speak for himself, and so I add these next few comments with some caution. But I would respond to my colleague by saying that giving up anger does not mean that we give up our passion for justice. It does not mean that we are not deeply saddened and horribly dismayed by much of what troubles the world. And it does not mean that we hold in any less esteem those who are angry. If anything, the anger we feel can be used to fuel the passion for the change we wish to see in the world. And perhaps for those who have never known discrimination, who have never known violence or oppression, the challenge for us will be to find that passion. I will say it one final time. We are not separate. I want to know your hurt so we can respond together from our oneness. As Unitarian Universalists, we will spend a lifetime struggling to understand the human experience, struggling to improve our awareness of who we are and how we are related to the web of life. As Unitarian Universalists, we journey together with those who have different life experiences than our own, because we know that to journey alone or with others who are just like us could not be more limiting, could not be more debilitating in our search for understanding and wisdom. As Unitarian Universalists, we may be captains of our own ships, but we also know that we sail in a much larger sea. We know that any words we speak or any action we take will have one of two effects. It will add to the meaning of life for ourselves, for other sentient beings, and it will add to the quality of life that we share in our interrelatedness. Or our words and actions will take away from that same life that we so desperately want to uphold and affirm. As Unitarian Universalists, may we choose to add meaning and quality to the interdependent life we share, because when we do, we are at the same time choosing life for ourselves. May it be so.